Cancel the medical transfer and have the private secretary wait outside. 11 words, spoken at normal volume in a corridor of the east wing of Buckingham Palace at around 4 in the afternoon, and somehow, the entire floor seemed to stop. Behind the door at the end of that corridor, the Queen had been lying in a darkened room for 2 days. The curtains were drawn, her telephone had been diverted, meals were being carried in on trays and coming back mostly untouched. And inside the household, one letter had quietly become the most important piece of paper in the building. A letter from a private clinic in Chelsea had been circulating since Friday. Near the end of that letter was a paragraph saying that removing the Queen from her household responsibilities at that moment could seriously damage her recovery. Because of those words, the King had stopped signing. And the document he had stopped signing would have transferred control of the private royal purse to his sister, Princess, and every allowance, every discretionary payment, every private staff wage connected to that household would have come under the control of the one member of the family nobody had ever accused of spending money carelessly. But about 90 minutes before Anne spoke those 11 words in the corridor, she had discovered something that changed everything. The paragraph that had stopped the King from signing was not written by a doctor. And by 7 that evening, the Queen was sitting in the back of a car heading west on the A4 toward Wiltshire, while the office that had controlled her budgets was being stripped of its financial authority. Now, hold on to that paragraph for a moment, because it only makes sense once you understand everything underneath it. It was 31 words. They had arrived at the clinic already typed. And the doctor whose name eventually appeared beneath them never claimed that he had written them. Quick word before we continue. I'm Harold, and I spend my time going through the little pieces of information surrounding this family, household accounts, letters, emails, documents, and those tiny details that seem completely unimportant until somebody finally reads them properly. Stay with me, because what ended this story was not simply an illness, and it was not really the doctor. It was one line in an email sent at 11 minutes past 9 on a Thursday morning, and that line is the reason a Queen spent that night in Wiltshire. Let me start with the money, because the money is what brought all of this together, and almost nobody outside that building truly understands how it works. The private royal purse is not taxpayers' money, and it is not the sovereign grant used for official state duties. It is the internal financial engine of a royal household, private staff wages, maintenance, personal allowances, discretionary payments, and all the unseen expenses required to keep a household running. For years, individual households had been able to authorize certain spending and account for it afterward. Charles wanted that system tightened. He had been working toward it for nearly a year. And anybody who has followed his career knows that he has wanted a smaller, more controlled monarchy for decades. The accession finally gave him the authority to make those changes. His proposal was simple, one central point of control for internal spending, with anything above a modest threshold requiring another signature. And the person he had chosen to provide that second level of control was his sister, Anne. That choice told everyone inside the building exactly what Charles thought the problem was. Anne was 75. She had carried out hundreds of public engagements in the previous year, working more consistently than almost anyone else in the family. She did it without a huge personal press operation, without needing to constantly reinvent her image, and without being impressed by titles or ceremony. Now imagine that woman sitting down with household accounts and examining them line by line. For most households, it meant paperwork. For one household, it meant the possible end of an arrangement that had existed for around 20 years. Because during those years, the Queen had built something inside those walls that did not appear neatly on any organizational chart. Private staff, communications, discretionary arrangements, payments and allowances that had accumulated over time. None of that automatically meant anything illegal. And that distinction matters. Large institutions develop complicated systems. Royal households are no different. But Anne's new authority meant those arrangements would suddenly have to pass across one desk, and that desk belonged to someone who had spent 50 years refusing to be impressed by anybody. The draft threshold was £5,000. Anything above it would require another signature. And while £5,000 might sound like a large amount, people who understand household accounts know exactly where that threshold becomes interesting. Retainers, consultancies, standing arrangements, smaller discretionary payments. Anne's office had already conducted an initial test on one household. The results showed 14 separate arrangements sitting between £4,000 and £5,000 in a single year. 14 payments. None individually large enough to attract much attention. But together, they became extremely interesting. And then, almost immediately after the threshold was circulated, those payments stopped being made in the same way. Nobody publicly claimed they had been deliberately structured to avoid scrutiny. But inside the building, people noticed. The Queen tried the normal route first. She went to her husband. She did not create a scene. She did not issue an ultimatum. She made an argument, the kind of practical argument two people married for years might make to one another. Anne was 75. She already worked more than almost anyone else. Adding responsibility for the household accounts to her workload, the Queen argued, would be unfair and potentially damaging. Instead, she suggested that oversight remain closer to her own office. She was already there every day. She knew the staff. Continuity, she argued, mattered as much as austerity. Every part of that argument was reasonable. But Charles said no. And he said no more than once. By the second week, the discussion had stopped being a discussion. The decision had already been made. The instrument was drafted. The signing was placed in the diary. And then the private secretaries began reacting. The Keeper of the Privy Purse is a real office, one of the oldest financial positions connected to the monarchy. It is essentially the closest thing the institution has to a finance director. The king was not abolishing that office. He was placing a member of the royal family above it with the power to veto certain spending. That distinction was enormous. An official can be persuaded. An official can be waited out. An official can eventually leave. But a princess of the blood who has decided that your allowance is unnecessary is a very different problem. The private secretaries understood that almost immediately. Two of them quietly requested meetings that week because suddenly they wanted certain arrangements put on the record. One wanted a note explaining that a standing arrangement in his household had been established before his time, on verbal instructions, and that he had never seen written authority for it. That is what institutions do when they sense an audit coming. They do not necessarily destroy anything. They create paperwork explaining that whatever is about to be discovered was not their decision. For such memoranda appeared within 10 days across 3 households. And then the Queen began looking unwell. This part needs to be handled carefully, because the exaggerated version of this story gets it completely wrong. She did not invent an illness. Nobody has produced evidence that she did. People around her noticed a change over roughly 10 days. She looked pale during internal briefings. She missed meetings she normally chaired. She spoke more quietly. She left a lunch early. One member of staff who had worked around her for years later described her as looking like someone running on nothing. And she had every reason to be exhausted. She was already older, and she had spent the previous 18 months watching her husband undergo medical treatment in public while continuing to carry her own responsibilities. That is the fair version. She was tired. She was struggling. And that part never stopped being true. Then the letter arrived. It came from a private clinic in Chelsea, printed on headed paper and signed by a respected consultant. It described exhaustion, low mood, a recommendation for rest, and a reduced schedule. Nothing about that was extraordinary. But near the end came one paragraph. A paragraph saying that suddenly restructuring the patient's household responsibilities, or removing her established administrative role, could cause a significant setback to her recovery, and that maintaining her existing oversight would provide routine and purpose. 31 words at the heart of the controversy. Read those words carefully and notice what they were not. They were not a diagnosis. They were not a prognosis. They were not treatment advice. They were not medication. They were instructions concerning an administrative decision. A doctor can absolutely say that a patient needs rest. A doctor can recommend reducing commitments. But telling a royal household which specific administrative responsibility should remain with the patient is something very different. That paragraph was not simply describing her health. It was influencing a decision. And Charles read it Friday evening. And stopped the signing. He did not simply postpone it. He went upstairs. For the next 2 days, he was constantly in and out of that room. He cancelled engagements himself, something he rarely did. By Sunday evening, staff had begun preparing a public bulletin because a queen who disappears for 2 days creates questions very quickly. The bulletin went through several drafts. It said she was resting on medical advice and that engagements had been postponed. But it never went out. Because once that announcement became public, the illness would no longer be a private family matter. It would become a public fact. And public facts are incredibly difficult to reverse. At the same time, another document was being prepared. A temporary financial arrangement. Not the permanent transfer. An interim instrument that would place household financial oversight with the Queen's office while she recovered. The covering note even referred to continuity being therapeutic. And it used the word clinicians, plural. Yet there was only one medical letter. And one signature. Charles was prepared to sign that interim arrangement on Tuesday afternoon. He was not sitting there believing he was being manipulated. He was a tired husband looking at a medical letter that appeared to tell him his wife could be harmed if he proceeded. Then and received a copy of the clinic letter. She read it. Then she read it again. And instead of arguing about the conclusion, she looked at the document itself. The letter was 2 pages. The suspicious paragraph was on page 2. And under proper light, the formatting looked slightly different. The spacing was tighter. The apostrophes were different. The typeface did not quite match. It was the sort of tiny formatting inconsistency that happens when a block of text is written somewhere else and inserted into a document. And did not accuse anyone. She did not storm into Charles's office. She waited. Because she knew that walking into her brother's study with nothing more than a formatting anomaly and a theory about a paragraph would achieve nothing. She needed something stronger. And then, Tuesday afternoon, she got it. Prince Louis happened to be at the residence because his parents were attending a reception in central London. He was looking for his great-aunt. He walked along the upper corridor and past a door that was not properly shut. He heard his grandmother laughing. That's all. He did not spy. He did not listen at the door. He did not secretly discover anything. He simply heard her laughing on the telephone. When he reached Anne's study, he mentioned that his grandmother sounded better because she was laughing and walking around. And then did not treat that as evidence. Because it wasn't. A person recovering from exhaustion can laugh. A person can walk around their room and still be unwell. But his comment gave in one useful piece of information. The Queen was well enough to have a conversation. And that raised a much more important question. If she was well enough to speak, had she personally requested that those words about her job be inserted into the medical letter? There was also an adult protection officer present. So nobody needed to question a child later. Louis had said one ordinary sentence in front of an adult witness. And then his part in the story ended. And now had a question that could be checked. So she went to Chelsea. She did not call ahead. She did not make a dramatic entrance. She simply told her protection officer where she was going. Within half an hour, she was outside the clinic. She asked politely for the consultant. Then she waited. 11 minutes. She stood in the waiting room with 2 other patients, reading a magazine and refusing to use her telephone. The receptionist offered to see whether the doctor could be interrupted. And said there was no need. She waited. Because that was her method. No shouting. No threats. No announcement. Just waiting. The consultant eventually came out and took her into his office. And asked one question. Did you write the second paragraph on page 2? There was a pause. Then he said no. He went to a filing cabinet and returned with something far more important than the letter itself. An email chain. The paragraph had arrived at the clinic already written. It had been sent at 11 minutes past 9 on Thursday morning. The email came from inside the Queen's private office. It was addressed to the practice manager. Nobody else had been copied. The message said the household had prepared suggested wording for the closing section and would be grateful if it could be reflected in the letter. Then came the 31 words. The consultant had actually questioned them. He had written back that the wording went beyond what he could properly certify, that the specific arrangement of the patient's duties was outside his competence, and that he preferred to describe the need for rest in general terms. Then came the reply. The wording had already been discussed and agreed at the appropriate level. The household would be grateful if the letter could be issued in the agreed form. 9 polite words buried inside that message. Discussed and agreed at the appropriate level. No name. No meeting. No person who could be identified. The consultant eventually admitted that he assumed somebody senior had approved it. He had a waiting room full of patients. He did not want a confrontation with a royal household over wording. So he inserted the paragraph. No bribe. No secret account. No dramatic conspiracy. Just one professional, one carefully worded email, and one paragraph that he had already said was outside his competence. And asked him if he would explain that to the king. He asked if he had a choice. She told him he did. And if he preferred, she would take the printed email chain herself. But she believed it was better for him to be in the room and explain it himself. He agreed. And took him back to the palace through a side entrance. And that is where those 11 words from the beginning finally happened. Cancel the medical transfer and have the private secretary wait outside. The private secretary was already standing outside Charles's study with the interim instrument ready for signature. And opened the door. She entered with the consultant. Then she closed it behind her. Charles looked up. He apparently asked whether it could wait. And said no. She explained that the paragraph had not been written by the doctor. She explained that the wording had been sent to the clinic from inside his wife's office 3 days before the letter appeared. And then. She stepped back. She let the consultant speak. That was crucial. And did not want to be the person making the accusation. She wanted the person whose name was on the medical document to explain what he had actually written. For about 40 minutes, the consultant walked Charles through the entire chain. The original email. His objection. The reply. The final letter. And throughout the conversation, he kept repeating the distinction that mattered most. The illness was real. He had personally assessed the Queen. She was exhausted. She was low. And he stood by every clinical word he had written. The only part he had not written was the section about her job. Charles listened. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he placed both hands flat on the desk. The person in the room said what appeared on his face was not anger. It was something heavier. Because decades earlier, another woman in that family had been described in documents written by people who were not in the room with her. Those descriptions had helped determine what she was allowed to do. And Charles had spent years being asked why nobody stopped it. Now, another woman was being described on paper. But this time, the description was being used to preserve something rather than take it away. Charles asked the consultant one question. Would removing the household accounts actually harm her? The consultant's answer was no. He said, clinically, the opposite was more likely. Someone suffering from that level of exhaustion would normally benefit from having fewer responsibilities, not more. The very responsibility the paragraph had been written to preserve was, in his professional opinion, something she should have been relieved from. Charles sat quietly with that answer. Then he sent for his wife. It was around 10 minutes past 5. She came downstairs slowly. One hand against the wall. A dressing gown over a nightdress. One of her women half a step behind her in case she needed support. Then she saw Anne. And she saw the consultant standing beside her. Those who witnessed the moment described the same thing. She stopped. Her hand came away from the wall. And for just slightly too long, her face became completely still. Charles told her the consultant had explained the correspondence. She said the pressure had become unbearable. She said she had wanted to protect her household through a difficult period. She said and had been working on Charles for months. Then Charles asked one question. Had she known that paragraph was going to be sent? She did not answer. That was it. No screaming. No dramatic confession. No explosive confrontation. Just one question. And silence. And stepped forward with the instrument that had been waiting for the king's signature. And this time, Charles signed. The Queen's discretionary budgets were revoked. Private allowances connected to her office were suspended pending review. Control of the private purse went to Anne. There would be no temporary arrangement. The private communications operation was dissolved. Staff were offered redeployment elsewhere in the household. And the Queen would no longer remain at the palace that night. She went to Ray Mill. And that detail matters. She was not thrown onto the street. Ray Mill House in Wiltshire belonged to her. She had bought it years earlier, before much of this story had happened. It was hers. It had always been hers. And she had spent countless weekends there. At around 7 that evening, she left Buckingham Palace in the rain. Dark coat. Side entrance. Car waiting. But the real humiliation was not the car. It was the corridor. Because the private secretary was still standing outside Charles's study. He had been there since 4. He was still holding the folder containing the interim instrument that would have transferred control to the Queen. And now the woman that document had been prepared for was walking past him without saying a word. Neither of them spoke. Several members of staff saw it. The consultant returned to work the next morning. He continued seeing patients. No regulator opened an investigation because there was no evidence that he had falsified the medical findings. He had made a poor professional decision about a paragraph outside his competence. But he had also objected to it in writing. The practice manager later left. And that was the only career in this story that actually ended. Nothing was publicly announced. Nothing needed to be. The Queen's absence was noticed. She did not attend an engagement that remained on the schedule. The listing had not even been properly withdrawn. Correspondents noticed. Then more noticed. By the weekend, the outline had appeared in several newspapers. The palace said nothing. And that silence only made the story more interesting. Because one thing about royal institutions has always been true. Paper survives people. An email survives the person who sent it. A memorandum survives the person who approved it. And eventually, somebody opens the file. So let me return to the point I made at the beginning. The illness was real. The consultant assessed her. He stood by his diagnosis. He never withdrew those clinical findings. The false part was not her health. The false part was the suggestion that her illness required her to retain control of the household. She was tired. She was struggling. But she was not incapable of making decisions. Somebody had taken the distance between those two facts. And filled it with 31 words. 31 words sent to a doctor before he ever signed the letter. 31 words designed to influence a husband who loved his wife. And those words nearly stopped a financial reform that had been months in preparation. But Anne noticed something almost nobody else would have noticed. The typeface. The spacing. The tiny formatting mistake. And instead of shouting about it, she followed the paper trail. She found the doctor. She found the email. She found the person who had objected. And she brought the evidence directly to the king. That is why those 11 words in the corridor mattered. Cancel the medical transfer and have the private secretary wait outside. Because by the time Anne said them, the decision had already changed. The review of the discretionary allowances continued. And what it began finding was not some enormous missing fortune. It was something far more ordinary. A long list of arrangements created through verbal instructions. Renewed year after year. Paid without anyone stopping to ask what exactly they were for. One had been running for years. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Institutions do not always break because of villains. Sometimes they break because nobody asks the simple question. Who authorized this? For years, another woman in that same palace had been described in documents she was never shown. Difficult. Not coping. Needs managing. Descriptions written by people who were not necessarily in the room with her. And those descriptions helped decide what happened to her. Decades later, 31 words were placed into another woman's medical letter. But this time, somebody in that family picked up the page. Looked closely. And asked who had actually written it. The Queen had spent years building an operation around herself. Staff she trusted. Budgets she controlled. A private system that existed largely because of her position and her marriage. And in a single afternoon, that entire arrangement disappeared. Not because the illness was fake. Not because the doctor was a fraud. Not because somebody was caught stealing money. But because one paragraph crossed a line it should never have crossed. And because Princess Anne refused to accept a piece of paper simply because it carried a doctor's name. And perhaps that is the real lesson buried inside this entire story. In a palace filled with titles, traditions, ceremonies, and people trained to speak carefully. Sometimes the most powerful thing anyone can do is simply look at a document and ask. Who wrote this? And why?